The crew never actually saw the shell that was supposed to kill them. What they remember is the sound. A single flat crack in the distance deeper than a rifle, sharper than artillery. Men who'd survived long enough in a Sherman learned to recognize it the way sailors recognize a breaker on the rocks. An 88. In the space of half a second, 4 sets of hands tightened on grips and levers, breath caught in 4 throats. They'd seen with their own eyes what that gun did to tanks like theirs. Then came the hit. White flash, a brutal physical punch through the steel floor. The whole tank rang as if a giant had swung a hammer against the hull. Dust dropped from weld seams like rain. Grit stung their eyes. Somebody shouted, somebody swore. Somebody's voice turned into a half-formed prayer. And then nothing. No shriek of molten metal scything through the crew compartment. No sheets of flame racing up from the fuel. No turret filling with smoke and screams. Just 4 men in a dim, dust-filled steel box, still breathing. On the outside, there was a fresh scar on the nose of an M4 Sherman. Torn canvas. Sand pouring out of shredded bags. A gouge and a spare track link bolted at a strange angle. The gun that had killed hundreds of tanks had just bounced. So what happened? How does a legendary tank-killing 88 Michelle hit a Sherman at lethal range and fail? Was this a miracle, a myth, a bad shell? Or did something about that stupid, junk welded and strapped to the front of the tank actually change the math of survival? Stick with this story, because to understand that moment, we have to walk you back to the beginning. To a man the official records barely notice, and to an idea the Army officially hated. We'll call him Sergeant Miller. That's not his real name. He stands in here for a lot of men, American, British, Canadian, who fought the war in Shermans and lived long enough to start getting creative. Picture him in England, spring of 1944. Not the movie version. No square-jawed hero music. Just a tired, overworked tank commander in his mid-20s, a couple of stripes on his sleeve, and more responsibility than anyone that age should ever have. He's standing beside his tank in a muddy field, staring at the front plate. At this point in the war, the Sherman already has a reputation. Some of it fair, some of it exaggerated. The German nickname Tommy Cooker. The American joke, Ronson lights first time every time. If you've seen enough burned-out turrets, you don't really care whether the statistics agree with the rumor mill. You believe what you can see from the back of the recovery truck. Miller had seen it. He'd climbed on top of blackened hulls, looked down through holes where steel used to be. He'd run his fingers around neat. Circular punch marks the size of a fist where a German gun had gone in and then exploded out the other side. He'd seen the way the armor failed. Shot right through the big, flat plates on the front. Penetrations along weld seams. Hits that came in square and straight and honest and left nothing living inside. So imagine you're him for a moment. You know in a few weeks you're going to be sent across the channel into Normandy. You've heard the stories about tigers and panthers waiting on the other side. You've seen the photos from Russia. You've passed around that blurry picture of a tiger straddling a road like a concrete bunker on tracks. You also know you're not getting a brand new wonder weapon. You have this, a medium tank designed before the war with friendly lines on the drawing board and a reputation for catching fire. What do? Do you trust the people back at the proving grounds who say, "It's good enough, we've done the math"? Or do you start looking at that big flat nose of your Sherman and think, if I can't get more tank, maybe I can get more something? That's where the stupid idea starts. At first, it's small. Some units had already begun hanging spare track links on the hull. It made intuitive sense, extra metal in front of the real armor. Maybe it slows a shell down. Maybe it catches a fragment. Besides, it's free, the links are lying around anyway. Miller took that a step further. He watched engineers pile sandbags for revetments around guns. Watched bullets chew dirt and sand instead of men. He knew sand was heavy, sure, but it was also dense, cheap, and available. One afternoon, while maintenance crews were scrounging parts, he put his crew to work. Canvas bags, shovels, muddy hands. They started stacking sandbags across the lower front hull, 3 layers deep, then up the sides. Then on the glacis. The bags went on wet, heavier, denser, more mass for whatever hit them. Spare track links came next, not just tossed on as an afterthought, but placed deliberately. One here at that weld seam he'd seen fail on a wreck. Another mounted at a slight tilt over the driver's viewport area. Bolts, makeshift brackets, a few ugly weld beads. Scrap metal followed, chopped off chunks of ruined armor from a wrecked tank. A steel plate they'd liberated from a knocked-out self-propelled gun. Anything that looked like it might make a shell wobble or explode early or be deflected a few degrees. The result when they were done did not look like the clean, well-ordered Shermans in the manual. It looked like a rolling junkyard. Other crews walked past and laughed. "Hey, Miller, you planning to invade France or build a fort? Somebody tell him we're supposed to fight, not move the beach." The mechanics didn't laugh. They swore. All that extra weight meant more strain on suspensions and final drives. Shermans weren't exactly overbuilt in the drivetrain department to begin with. They broke under normal loads. Add a ton or two of sand and steel, and you were asking for more breakdowns. Higher command wasn't amused either, because here's a crucial piece of the story. Behind the lines, the U.S. Army and its British counterparts had already tested this kind of thing. They'd taken captured German guns and lined up scrapped Shermans. They debuilt controlled test rigs, fired armor-piercing rounds at medium tank hulls with and without sandbags. The data, the cold numbers, had not been kind to the sandbag enthusiasts. Against the very weapon Miller feared, most high-velocity AP from guns like the 88 sandbags did almost nothing on their own. The shells just punched through the bags, turned the sand into high-speed dust and grit, and then went on into the real armor with barely reduced energy. On paper, in controlled conditions, the verdict was clear: useless weight, extra stress on engines and suspensions, more fuel burned, more bridge load limit problems for combat engineers to worry about. Some commanders, like General Patton later in the war, would flatly ban the practice. Remove the sandbags, the concrete, the rails. Trust the design, trust maneuver and tactics, not superstition. From their perspective, they weren't being heartless. They were following test results. They were trying to keep their armored divisions mobile. They were thinking about the average case over hundreds of tanks, thousands of miles, not the one in 1,000 miracle deflection. But if you were Sergeant Miller, you didn't live in the averages. You lived inside one tank. You lived with 4 sets of boots under one thin floor. You charged one hedgerow at a time. You knew that any given shell could have your name on it. So when the order filtered down through the grapevine from brigade to battalion to company that unauthorized armor was to be removed, Miller stalled. He'd pull some of it off when an officer was in sight. He'd argue about transmission temps and bogey wear. He'd nod when people pointed at test charts. Then when nobody was looking too closely, he'd restack the bags, bolt the tracks back on. Weld another ugly bracket. Why? Because he'd noticed something the charts didn't talk much about. The test ranges often put the shell exactly where they wanted it. Straight-on hits, comfortable ranges, perfect photographs of penetration and spalling. But the battlefield, that was messy. Shells came in at odd angles. Tanks were half-turned on slopes in ditches. Shots clipped house corners, hit tree limbs, skipped off rocks before slamming into armor. And Miller had started to develop a gut feeling. If he couldn't make his Sherman thicker, maybe he could make it messier. Harder to hit clean. He couldn't do equations about obliquity or yaw. But he could stand in front of his tank, imagine a shell coming in from this direction or that, and ask, where can I put something that might just nudge it off even a little? A spare track link at an angle. A steel plate spaced a few inches in front of the real armor. A wall of wet sand that might break a fuse or tilt a projectile. Does that sound naive? Desperate? Or, if you're honest, like exactly the kind of thinking you'd fall into if people you knew kept dying in steel boxes like yours? Now, before we go back to that 88 hit, we need to take a short detour into the unglamorous world of armor geometry. Don't worry, you won't need a calculator, just a bit of imagination. Take a thin notebook and hold it flat, facing you. If you try to poke a pencil straight through the front, it doesn't take much force. Now tilt the notebook back so the front cover slopes away from you like the windshield of a car. Try to poke through again at the same spot. It feels harder, doesn't it? You haven't actually made the notebook thicker. You've changed the angle the pencil has to travel through. The pencil has to punch through more paper to get to the other side. Tank armor works the same way. A plate of steel, when you tilt it back, effectively behaves thicker to a projectile coming in from the front. At about 60 degrees from vertical, the armor can be almost twice as effective as the same thickness straight up and down. This is why some WWII tanks like the Soviet T-34 or later the German Panther had those distinctive sloped front hulls. They weren't magical. They were just using geometry to get more protection out of the same amount of steel. The Sherman's early models, by contrast, had more conservative slopes and big areas of relatively flat plate, especially low on the bow. Good enough against many threats, not good enough against everything. But geometry doesn't begin and end at the drawing board. It's not just the slope of one plate. It's the whole path the projectile has to travel. That's where spaced armor comes into the story. Imagine again that pencil and notebook. Now, instead of one thick book, you have two thin ones with a little gap of air between them. You poke the pencil through the first, and it's already wobbling a bit when it hits the second. Sometimes that wobble makes all the difference. In tank terms, a shell that passes through one-layer sandbags, track link scrap plate might be tilted, slowed, broken, or have its fuse triggered early. By the time it reaches the main armor, it's not flying as clean and strong as it was a few meters back. This is especially important for a particular kind of nasty warhead that became common later in the war: the shaped charge, or heat round the kind used in Panzerfausts and Panzerschrecks. Those weapons don't rely on sheer speed, but on forming a high-velocity jet of metal when they detonate. Give that jet empty space to expand in, or a barrier to detonate it a little too far away from the main armor, and you can drastically reduce its ability to punch through. In that case, sandbags, mesh, even bed frames strapped to the side of a vehicle can, in some situations, help. But our story is about an 88 armor piercing round a solid shot relying on mass and velocity, not a shaped charge. Against that threat, sandbags alone, as the test ranges showed, were not miracle armor. However, what if those sandbags, track links, and scrap plates were just enough to tilt the shell a few degrees, to make it hit on a corner instead of flat? To move the impact point a few inches up, down, left, or right, where something stronger or more angled was waiting? What if that stupid field mod didn't change the thickness much, but changed the geometry? Hold that thought as we roll into Normandy. Miller's tank, his rolling junk pile, comes ashore days after D-Day. The first thing the crew learns is that rumors travel faster than tanks. There are stories about tigers in every hedgerow. Veterans quickly learn that many of those tigers are actually less imposing German machines, Panzer IVs, Stu GS, even pack guns dug into banks. To a frightened infantryman, anything knocking out Shermans from long range becomes a tiger. But somewhere out there, behind those bocage walls, the real thing lurks. The Tiger Eye, thick armor in big, flat slabs. A front hull plate 100 thick, almost twice that of a Sherman's nose. A square turret face like the front of a safe. And projecting from that turret, the thing that worries Sherman crews most, the 88 KWK-36. Originally designed as an anti-aircraft gun, then turned into one of the most feared anti-tank weapons of the war, the 88 could, under the right conditions, punch through a Sherman from well over a kilometer away. At typical engagement ranges in the claustrophobic hedgerows, its penetration was not the problem. Finding a target was. In that environment, the geometry of the battlefield was as important as the geometry of steel. Short sightlines, sudden fields of fire, ambush positions. Miller and his crew learned quickly to fear not just the big cats, but the smaller guns. The 75 and 50 anti-tank guns hidden in farmyards, the Panzerfausts waiting around corners. Through all of it, they carried their extra weight. The mechanics cursed them every time the tank limped back into a forward repair point with a burned-out bogey or a smoking final drive. Officers continued to grumble about unauthorized modifications. A couple of times, Miller was ordered to pull some of the sand off and did, at least temporarily, when scrutiny got intense. But somehow, enough of the junk stayed on. Maybe it was the way the crew believed in it that made their platoon leader think twice. Maybe it was the losses starting to pile up that made officers quietly relax about unofficial fixes, as long as the tanks kept moving. Because the Shermans did burn. Some to mines, some to knocking matches with better gun German tanks, some to a lucky shot from a handheld weapon fired from 10 yards away. Miller saw friends die. Tanks he'd parked beside a week earlier now reduced to twisted, soot-black skeletons by the side of a Norman lane. Each time, when the immediate shock wore off, he came back to his own tank and stared at his sandbags and scrap. What would you do at that point? Would you take it all off because some test range back in the States said it wasn't worth it? Or would you look at the chaos around you and think, if there's even a 1% chance this helps, I'm keeping it. Let's move forward then to one particular day. The exact date doesn't matter. Historians still argue about which anecdote matches which after-action report. Think late summer or early autumn, somewhere between the hedgerows and the Siegfried Line, a patchwork of fields, half-ruined villages, and tree lines under a low European sky. The infantry are reporting a heavy gun ahead. Could be a tank, could be a towed cannon, could be that 88 everyone keeps talking about in hushed tones. Miller's platoon is ordered up to support an advance. Typical chaos. Maps that don't quite match the ground, radio chatter overlapping with shouted instructions, the ever-present background noise of artillery doing its sullen work somewhere else. Inside Miller's Sherman, the air is already heavy with the smells that become weirdly normal in war. Oil, sweat, gunpowder from the last few rounds spent clearing a hedgerow, the faint tang of exhaust leaking in. They nose forward along a sunken lane, hedges high on either side like green walls. The driver works the steering levers gently, trying to keep the ride smooth. The gunner squints through his sight, scanning the few openings where a dangerous barrel tip might appear. The worst part, the crew will later agree, is the waiting. They know something is ahead. They do not know where. The commander is half out of the hatch, binoculars up, nerves jangling. One wrong move and he could be the first to take a sniper's bullet. One right move and he could be the reason they see the enemy a second before the enemy sees them. "Hold up," he might say into the intercom. "There, that gap in the hedgerow, 11 o'clock. A pause, a flicker of movement, a glint, then that sound, that awful, unforgettable crack in the distance. If you talk to men who heard it and lived, they struggle to describe it. Not just volume, they'd heard bigger booms from friendly artillery. It was the quality of the sound, like something snapping, clean and violent. The gunner has no time to think about it. His body flinches on instinct. His hands, wrapped around the elevation and traverse controls, tighten. His foot maybe presses the trigger pedal half an inch without meaning to. The driver's world, briefly, becomes pure noise and motion. The shell in 88 APCBC, if you want the technical term, has already left the barrel before the sound reaches them. It's a chunk of steel, about as long as your forearm, flying at well over 800 meters per second. At that speed, it would cross a football field in less than half a second. By the time the crew's muscles register incoming, the shell's already done whatever it's going to do. Here, the story splits. In the usual version, the round would hit the Sherman's front plate more or less straight on, at a range of a few hundred meters, and travel through like a red-hot knife. The nose cap would fracture, the armor would crack, and a shower of high-speed fragments steel from the shell, steel from the tank itself, would scythe through the crew compartment. In those tanks, the world ends in microseconds. But Miller's Sherman was not the test hull on a proving ground. Its lower front was covered in 3 layers of wet sandbags. Above that, on the sloped glacis, spare track links sat at odd angles, some lifted away from the main armor by improvised brackets. Here and there, small plates of scrap steel created tiny steps in the profile. We don't know the exact path the shell took. No one had a slow-motion camera on the day, but battlefield accounts and post-war analysis give us a plausible sequence. The 88 round, aimed at what the German gunner could see of the Sherman's nose, first struck the outer layer, sandbags. It punched through them in a fraction of a second, tearing canvas, explosively displacing sand. That alone wouldn't have stopped it. But even that violent interaction might have done something small but important, added a little yaw, a slight wobble. Next, the shell encountered a spare track link that Miller's crew had bolted onto the hull at a shallow angle, canting upward. Track links are made of good, tough steel. They're not uniform and they're not designed as armor, but they have mass and, more importantly, shape. If the yawed 88 round hit the curved or beveled part of that link instead of its flat center, it might have been tipped again, deflected a few degrees off its original trajectory. Now we're deep into geometry. A few degrees over a very short distance can mean the difference between a shell striking the main armor at nearly 90 degrees ideal for penetration, or at, say, 50 or 60 degrees, where the effective thickness skyrockets and the chance of a ricochet rises. Maybe the shell shattered. That happened sometimes with Allied rounds against German armor. It could happen the other way around under bad conditions. Maybe the round stayed intact but tried to bite into the main glacis plate at too sharp an angle and simply skipped. We know this much. It did not carve a neat, round tunnel into the crew compartment. It did not send a spray of incandescent metal through 4 men. What the crew knew in that instant was simpler. A blinding flash from somewhere low and left. A monstrous impact that felt like the hull had been kicked by God. Dust and sand exploding into the tank through the smallest seams. The ringing physical pain of overpressure in their ears. And then the uncanny realization as vision cleared that they were not on fire. They were not, as one would later put it, scattered all over the inside of the turret like tomato soup. The radio might crackle. Voices outside tinny through the hull. The commander's own voice, hoarse, shouting something like, "I'm all right. Report." One by one, the crew answer, no blood, no missing limbs, just bruises and a headache and a story that sounds, to other tankers, almost indecently lucky. Of course, they're not out of danger. The German gunner is probably ramming home another round even as they get their bearings. The platoon's own gunner is already swinging the turret, heart-pounding, trying to put a shell back down range. The firefight that follows is its own blur of half-remembered images. Muzzle flashes in hedgerows, the crack and crash of rounds striking earth and steel, a gun shield in the distance shattering under a Sherman's HE round. But that single moment, the first hit, is what stays with them. Later, when the ground has moved forward and the wrecks have been pushed aside, somebody, maybe Miller himself, maybe a maintenance sergeant, walks around to the nose of the tank. They see where the impact was. The sandbags are shredded, their innards spilled. A track link is cracked, twisted, hanging at a crazy angle. The main armor behind it bears a bright scar, maybe a shallow gouge, but no gaping hole. No blackened rim of a penetrative blast. Somewhere out there, maybe half buried in a hedgerow, is the spent shell or the largest fragment of it. Did that extra junk they piled on really save their lives? If you're the crew, the answer is obvious. Of course it did. In their minds, they can picture the path. No sandbags, clean hits straight through, we're dead. With sandbags, tracks, scrap. One hell of a scare, but we're here to talk about it. Ask an engineer and you'll get a more cautious response. Maybe the projectile was faulty. Wartime quality control wasn't perfect. Maybe the German gunner misjudged the distance and range. The round came in a little low and ricocheted off a ridge hidden from his view. Maybe hit location more than any field mod did the real work. The truth probably lives somewhere in the overlap, a slightly off-center hit. A round that struck not the bare glacis, but a jumbled concoction of sand, steel, and air gaps. Enough small deflections, velocity loss, and changes of angle stacked together to rob the 88 of its killer's edge in that one instance. You can hear the friction here between two ways of seeing war. On the one hand, the institution, armies, test ranges, data. For them, sandbagging tanks had been measured, weighed, and found wanting most of the time. It hurt reliability and fuel economy for very little average gain. On the other hand, the man in the turret, one tank, one crew, one hit. If even one of those modifications helps turn that one hit into a non-kill, there's no such thing as useless weight. There's just the junk that kept us alive. What would you believe if you'd been inside that Sherman? In the weeks that followed, stories like Miller's bounced around mess tents and motor pools. Did you hear about the tank in Baker Company that took an 88 in the nose and kept going? Every retelling added a little, polished a detail, turned the 88 from a hit near the front into a point-blank, straight-on shot. Other crews, even some who'd rolled their eyes at the junkyard Sherman, started adding a few extra bags. Maybe a couple more track links. You never knew. Meanwhile, up the chain of command, the official line didn't change much. Patton's directive against unauthorized armor came later in 1945 and was blunt. His argument, weight and clutter, were slowing down his armored spearheads. If the Ordnance Department said it didn't help, then it didn't help. Take it off. Some units obeyed strictly. Others, further from the general's direct gaze, quietly did what made them feel better under fire. Historians still debate the aggregate effectiveness of field modifications like sandbagging. Against hand-held heat weapons like the Panzerfaust, possibly quite helpful by creating crude spaced armor that forced the shaped charges jet to form and dissipate before it hit the main hull. Against large, high-velocity armor-piercing guns like the Tiger's 88, much less so. But here's the thing. War isn't an engineering lab. You can be right on average and still be dead in one specific case. You can be wrong in the data and still have a crew climbing out of a tank with a long, shocked silence instead of being zipped into bags. And this is where the wider story opens up. Because that messy, improvised pile of sand, track, and scrap is, in a way, a clumsy preview of where armored warfare would go after the war ended. Look at almost any modern tank or infantry fighting vehicle, and you'll see ideas that would have made Miller's jury-rigged Sherman seem less crazy. You'll see sloped armor used deliberately to increase effective thickness. You'll see spaced armor multiple layers of steel, composites, and air gaps designed to disrupt both kinetic penetrators and shaped charge jets. You'll see reactive armor bricks that explode outward to interfere with incoming rounds. You'll see slat armor cages around vehicles in urban combat zones, meant to prematurely detonate RPGs and protect the main hull. All of these rely in one way or another on geometry beating thickness. on giving the incoming threat a bad angle, a confusing path, a less efficient way to spend its lethal energy. Miller didn't know the equations those designers would one day use. He just took one look at the big flat plate of his Sherman and thought, "Can I make this less of a bullseye?" There is, of course, a danger in romanticizing this too much. Field modifications can help, but they can also backfire. Too much weight, badly distributed, really does break suspensions. Concrete slapped onto a hull can spall inward when hit, adding to the fragment problem instead of reducing it. Improvised armor can create blind spots, block access hatches, or interfere with turret traverse. For every wartime tale where sandbags saved a tank, there are others where the extra load simply made it more likely to break down in a critical moment, or eat fuel the supply lines struggled to deliver. But the deeper lesson isn't, sandbags are secret wonder armor. It's something subtler. Frontline improvisation and institutional testing live in tension, and that tension drives improvement. The proving ground officers were not villains. They saw patterns across hundreds of trials and tried to steer armies away from superstition and towards things that worked reliably. The sergeants, like Miller, weren't idiots. They lived in the gaps the tests couldn't fully model. Odd angles, bad days, one unlucky shot out of 1,000. Sometimes, between those two perspectives, something important emerges. In this case, the something was a growing appreciation among both soldiers and engineers that how a projectile meets armor can matter as much as how thick that armor is. When the smoke of WWII cleared and nations began designing the next generation of tanks, they took that to heart. American engineers gave later tanks more sloping and experimented with laminate and spaced arrays. The Soviets doubled down on heavily sloped designs, then composite armor. The British developed Chabam armor, layered and secretive, that owed as much to smart geometry and materials science as it did to simple thickness. And somewhere in the middle of all those polished blueprints and classified reports, you can still glimpse, faintly, the outline of a Sherman with wet sandbags roped to its nose and track links welded at ugly angles. A stupid idea born in fear, refined by necessity, vindicated in spirit, if not always in detail by history. So was Sergeant Miller's Sherman really tiger-proof? No. Nothing that went to war in 1944 was truly tiger-proof. Even the Tiger wasn't Panther-proof, or mine-proof, or bad-luck-proof. If you dropped that tank exactly as it was in front of a skilled Tiger crew on an open field at 1,000 meters, the sandbags wouldn't save it. If the 88 caught the bare plate at a good angle, the result would look like so many burned-out hulks lining European roads. But that's not where tanks fight most of the time. They fight in messy, broken landscapes where every hedgerow, building, and ditch changes the odds. They fight in half seconds and bad angles, and I thought the road turned left there moments. In that reality, Miller's junkyard Sherman didn't need to be invincible. It just needed once to turn a perfect kill shot into an imperfect one. One hit, one angle, one interaction between sand, scrap, and steel that changed what should have been 4 funerals into 4 men staring at each other in the dim light, hearts pounding, alive. As you watch footage of World War II tanks, now the gritty film of Shermans rattling down French lanes, the big cats prowling out of tree lines, it's easy to think in absolutes. This tank was bad, that one was good. This gun was unstoppable, that armor was paper thin. The truth, as always, is messier. A bad tank used well in the right terrain with a crew that refuses to stop thinking can become far more dangerous and far more survivable than its spec sheet suggests. A good tank misused, overloaded with superstition or false confidence, can die in seconds. So ask yourself, if you'd been in those muddy fields 80 years ago, would you have trusted the pamphlets and left your tank clean and by the book? Or would you have been out there with a welding torch and a stack of sandbags, taking your chances on geometry, luck, and a stupid idea? Because somewhere near the end of 1944, in a field cut by hedgerows and shell craters, one Sherman crew did just that. They gambled on junk and instinct. An 88 Michelle came for them, right where they lived. And when the dust cleared, and the ringing in their ears faded, and they climbed out to look at the scar on their tank's battered nose, they had to face a fact that no test report, no order, no statistic could quite erase. On that day in that place, thickness alone didn't decide the outcome. Geometry did.